Thank you, Cathie. Hello, everyone. Welcome, Vivian. Good to see you. It's a pleasure to be here, so thanks to the Center for inviting me today. This is a talk that's part of a project I've been working on for quite a few years now. I first started working on this topic back in 2016, 17. I hear you've suffered through one of my readings for your class. I hope it wasn't too painful. And in that context, what I want to think about is what happens when a large part of the electorate reaches a position in the economy where their livelihoods no longer depend on participation in the labor market and where their policy priorities shift. What happens to the relationship between democracy and capitalism when that shifts, right? So suppose I'm, 25, I've just exited university perhaps. I care a lot about finding a job, likelihood. I care a lot about my wages, not becoming unemployed. I care a lot about whether the society in which I inhabit is going to be growing in the next 20, 30 years, and therefore I care a lot about investments, physical investment, social investment, childcare. If I am, on the other hand, a bit older, above, I'm 60, perhaps 70s, and I'm out of the labor market and I'm relying on a pension, I'm relying first and foremost on that pension for my income stream, for my material livelihood. I care a lot about healthcare in addition to pensions. I probably care a lot about inflation if I have nominal assets of any kind that could be hurt by inflation. I don't care so much in a direct fashion. I could have altruistic beliefs. I don't care so much, about childcare. I don't care so much about social investment, physical capital investment. Long-term growth over the next 50 years is not going to affect me, right? So you can see that as the electorate switches, something goes on here in the priorities of a large part of the electorate. What I'm trying to do is to consolidate some of the ideas I'm mentioning today and I've worked on in the past into a monograph. The monograph doesn't yet fully exist. The proposal is out, being considered hopefully positively at OUP. And so, in that context, it's kind of work in progress. So I'm really interested in hearing whether that will make sense to you all. This is the sort of roadmap for the next 30 minutes or so. What I want to do is to just briefly fix ideas in terms of what's been going on in terms of the demographic shift, but take a longue durée approach from 1950 to now and even beyond, the kind of sense of what's going on in advanced economies in which we're currently located, but also beyond. You'll see that the rest of the world is also moving in that direction, right? So whatever we're trying to analyze today is just a glimpse of what's going to become a much more pressing matter in the next 30 or 40 years. Then I want to elaborate a schematic view of how we can tie what's going on in long-term shifts of the electorate, and the fact that the growing part of the electorate is growing perhaps older, how we can link that to economic performance in a way that doesn't just focuses on the economic behavior of pensioners, right? So this is not an argument about if I'm old, I'm investing less, or I'm saving, I'm selling my assets. This is an argument about what happens when the electorate changes in some fundamental way. So it's a case of that. How does that then shape government policy in a way that feeds back into economic performance? And then I want to try, if time allows, to give you a glimpse of 3 different types of evidence that hopefully ties this together. One has to be about how individuals of different age behave electorally and what kind of policy preferences they have. What do people care about? What do they want? Point number one. The second has to be about how that then links into different policy constellation. And the third one is to then bring it back to the economy. Okay, so motivation for the project. I'm sure all of you are aware of what's been happening, but I was myself struck by the numbers when I looked them up a bit more closely to look at this. I knew about what's been going on in Europe and in the US, hadn't looked at the world perspective until recently. This is percentage change over time with 1950 as the anchor. Obviously, populations have been growing everywhere to some extent, but not everyone has been growing equally in terms of the composition in the electorate. So you see here the elderly above 65, more than 450%. This is more than 4 times the growth you've had of people under 15, and about nearly 2 times what you've had in the middle of the working age population. Now, obviously, this tells you 2 things. One is actually the problem is likely worse because someone who's 55, in a lot of ways, if they have an equal weighting of the next 30 years of their life expectancy, are already in some ways quasi-elderly, perhaps in their voting behavior, if not indeed biologically. I don't want to ruffle any feathers here. We're all undergo this process. But the second point here, more importantly, is that this is going to get worse because the bottom of the pyramid just hasn't been picked up. So if you plot that forward, if you look at the projections, it's likely worse. And in fact, we were just discussing with a colleague here over lunch that the projections are being beaten. Fertility is shrinking even faster than we had anticipated in places like Korea, places like Japan, and elsewhere on the African continent as well, right? And so this is what happens here. You have the population pyramid. It's very well known. This is the 1950s, post-war boom. Many people are born. Not so many people make it to the top here. And as you expand over time, both genders, you see this expansion here up to here, and then this is the projection, right? And so you really see that the share of the population that's above a certain age becomes wider and wider. Not everyone, is the dynamics are not the same in all places. You see here the median age, so that's the age at which 50% are below that age and 50% are above that age. You see that in the sort of northwest of the world here, you have more than 50% above 50 years old, right? Stop for a second to think that among the people who are below 18, they're not voting, right? So if you have 50% above 50 years old, you actually have at least 70% of your electorate that's above 50, right? Again, depends a little bit where you think the cutoff point is. I actually think this is not a life cycle issue. I think it's a labor market position issue, as I'll discuss in a second. But other countries are also slowly getting there. This is another way to think about it in absolute numbers. You see the under 15 have stopped, slowly drawing. This is a bit of a logarithmic function in a sense. And here we're just about to really have the takeoff. Even now, you have nearly 1 billion here, 5 billion there. That's 1/5 of your electorate in the world, in that category. Closer to home, you don't just have a global variation. You have within-country variation. These are, I think, counties. You could look at it differently. On the right-hand side here, I think on the right-hand side is counties, and here it's a smaller unit as well. But the point being, in a lot of constituencies in our countries, the median age is already 50 or above again, right? And remember, people under a certain age don't vote. And as I'll show you later, the voting propensity by age group is such that actually this population picture gets accentuated. Okay. So given what I've just said, I mean, obviously I'm not the first to think about these issues, and by and large, and simplifying somewhat, and perhaps doing some injustice to the complexity of the current literature, I think for my purposes, the literature can be neatly divided in 3 camps. So in political science, there's been a lot of work looking at political participation. The elderly are more likely to vote. They're more likely to donate. They're more likely even to participate in other ways politically. They're more likely to write letters to their representatives. They're more likely to be politically interested in various kinds of ways. A lot of this might be of a generational rather than life cycle nature, but nevertheless, the propensities are pretty strong and they're pretty much consistent across countries. They also tend to be more to the right. Most countries, that translates in a greater propensity to vote for conservative parties. Some countries, some periods, it actually flips in some complex ways, but as an approximation, it's fair to say that you have this tendency to move to the right. They also have different preferences and priorities. What we know from the literature is caring a lot about pensions, caring a bit less about education and childcare, and so on and so forth. So you see already that there is an evidence base that, depending on your age, not surprisingly, and controlling for various other confounders, class, income, assets, and other things, you can still pick up an age effect. Now, some country studies in places, debate how much, it's so strong, but I think on average across countries, and I'll show you some data as well later of my own doing, there is a bit of a policy preference demographic structure emerging. Different priorities. My own work on inflation showed that if you're elderly for a whole range of reasons, you really care about inflation. Now, in fact, we're in a bit of a natural experiment for how that plays out. In our countries, with inflation shock coming in, the Conservative Party in the UK, what do? Lower taxes. Who gets lower taxes? People higher incomes, but that overlaps somehow with tax. Okay, so this is a really strong and long-lasting strand of literature here. What they haven't looked at so much is what does this do to the economy, right? Then in social policy and public policy, you have work looking at policy preferences. This is what I was already alluding to some extent, but looking not just at preferences, but looking at what happens to government allocation. Is it true that governments with larger populations in need of pensions spend more on pensions? Yes. Are those pensions necessarily more generous? It depends. So it's not necessarily a one-to-one kind of relationship. It depends a bit how it plays out electorally and the structure of party competition. Healthcare definitely expands, partly through need, not only to do with aging, partly through the introduction of technology. Treatments are getting more and more expensive and more effective, luckily, as well. Education and family, is this being crowded out? Again, some evidence that it might be in cases where the debt constraint kicks in, right? So if your budgets are very tight, you've got to choose, do I cut something with the cost will be seen 20, 30 years, or do I cut something with a strongly active community? We can think of the pension reform literature here. It's very difficult to retrench pensions, lots of cases. Economics, on the other hand, looks, not surprisingly, at economic outcomes. They've documented a bunch of effects on consumption, on investment, on savings, productivity. Even productivity within company. There's even work showing that, as your workforce ages within a company, you can track the productivity. And it's all very interesting and important, but by and large, if they treat it as a silo, they kind of assume all of this is kind of either secondary, or we can deal with it in a sort of policy normative way. This is what we ought to do, and then you guys in the government, you do it and you solve the problem. The problem is that actually, as I'm going to argue, this side and that side interact in a way that makes the problem even worse on the economic side, right? So it's one thing that people behave economically in a certain way, but then when they go vote and when they choose a government, they also behave in particular ways that shapes government policy. And so government policy is not some sort of an efficient, optimal policy response. It's driven by interest in the electorate and also the constellation of interest groups and other things that I don't want to underemphasize, but for my part, I'm focusing more on the electorate here. Okay, and so you can see that all of this leads me to say, in a way, are there political consequences of aging that impact the economy, right? So are there ways in which the aging of our population is changing the nature of the economy, not because of how and whether all the workers or all the consumers are different, but because of who and what they support in government. So in a sense, even in all the versions of the project, I had two kinds of responses to this framing of the argument. One was that obviously it must be true And the other was that obviously this must be wrong, because this is not how politics operate. And so I hope to convince the first side that it's not so obvious, and the second side that maybe there's some truth to it. If not in every single country election, but as a very long-term, big picture kind of change, right? So, I mean, obviously there's idiosyncrasies. Obviously there are ways in which countries and governments can depart from this. This is not a deterministic theory in that sense. Okay, so I think if we want to think about a political economy framework of what's going on with aging, we must start by thinking about the positionality of elderly people in economic terms and what that means for their political preference formation and their political behavior. The first thing to say is that this is a group that matters politically, right? I mean, this is a kind of necessary condition, because if the group is irrelevant politically, then the preferences are irrelevant, and then all of the rest of the chain disappears, right? This is not me. This is widely documented that you have these quote-unquote growing gray voters. I myself has, if I can say that, I don't know whether that should be recorded, but I have constantly wondered how the Conservative Party gets re-elected in the UK, that is, every election for quite some time, despite what are quite obviously very low degrees of economic performance, right? They are not performing even by the standards of what the agenda on the Conservative side, which is a legitimate agenda, what it's supposed to achieve, right? And I think part of the reason for that has to do, hopefully, with what I'm saying here. So grey power matters. Now, I think the thing that hasn't really been thought about is the material position of what it means to be a pensioner. People understand that if you're a pensioner, you don't like pension cuts, and if your health risk distribution goes up because you're of a certain age and perhaps of a certain informational competence, you understand that certain types of healthcare, health insurance, very important for you. Fine. But there is a salient fact, I mean, going back to Marx in a sense, that's really important for the elderly, which is that they are not in the labor market. And they're not in the labor market in a way that's different from the way an unemployed person, or even a rich person, or even someone who's out of the labor force and is, in a household, is out of the labor market. They're not in the labor market in a way that the output gap, so the way the economy is performing, and the unemployment risk distribution in society, to the extent that we're focusing here on self-interested formation, and we can, debate what's the weight in an individual of self-interest versus altruism, but to the extent that we focused on the self-interested leg, they are unaffected, at least in the short to medium term. They're probably not unaffected if they go to live 100 years old like my grandmother is. But even my grandmother, who's 100 years old since last April, and it's fantastic, has been on a pension for 40 years. Unemployment 15%, unemployment 5%, obviously she cares about us greatly, and so in that sense, there's an intergenerational linkage. But her material position is essentially pensions, social care, healthcare. The housing is sorted. In France, it's not very stock market based, and we can talk about whether and how that changes the picture, right? But she is someone who doesn't respond to it. Why does that matter? Because there's an immense literature ending in a beautiful way in Iverson and Susski's Democracy and Capitalism, latest book, that says economic voting. Governments perform because they get punished if they don't perform, right? Here this is different. Policy preferences, we talked a bit about that, right? You care a lot about policies that you benefit from, you care less about policies that you don't benefit from, you don't care at all about policies that are going to affect you in 30 years. Now, of course, people are future-oriented. I and others care about what's going on with the planet in 30 years' time, and of course people care about their children, right? So this is not an argument saying this doesn't matter. It's an argument that what matters is relative intensity of preferences. Yes, people care about the environment, but I cut pensions by 20% in France and Greece. I guess I get a certain kind of response. I don't increase taxes on the environment in France. Remember the Gilets jaunes? It was 5 pence or whatever it was on oil. That was already politically impossible, right? So it's not about people caring, in principle about things. It's what they're mobilized for. what they vote for, on average. We're not talking necessarily about people in this room or elsewhere. Okay, economic priorities, I mentioned. Inflation matters a lot to you if your pension is not protected. GDP growth, not so much. Unemployment, probably not at all. House prices, quite a lot. If you can remortgage, if you can leverage your asset to buy more consumption goods, that's going to help. Okay. Now, fine, we have this great power, and we have this assumed distribution of policy preferences and priorities, but how does that feed into policy? Now, this is actually not a minor matter, because if you look at a lot of literature, even on great power and pensions, it's often, when you read it, you really get a feeling that they assume away the linkage between this preference intensity and policy, right? And I think that's not satisfactory in theory terms. Now, I'm sure lots of different mechanisms are plausible here, but the three I want to focus on, are the following. Ex ante, you could imagine, before an election, that parties are going to try and offer certain policies and priorities to mobilize different parts of the electorate. What particular view you have of the nature of political competition, in a sense, is secondary. You could imagine a mechanism where they focus on their constituents, and that, so you have an asymmetric weight of the elderly in different parties. You could imagine that they're competing for a median voter, potentially plausible in majoritarian political system, not so much elsewhere. Or you could imagine that you have more targeted behavior on the part of the parties. What matters is that there's an incentive structure, obviously, for political parties to try and offer and to signal priorities and policies that are going to cut at certain groups. Okay, during their mandate, then once they get elected, you could imagine, so what happens if we just disregard the electorate, and that sometimes does happen, but there's a relatively large literature in political science that talks about policy responsiveness. Shifts of the public opinion affect governments, partly because they want to keep the peace within limits. We're back at the Gilets jaunes story, partly because they have an eye on the next election, and if they're too vastly off public opinion, you get in trouble. Again, we can have discussions about how democratic countries actually are and whether or not that captures perfectly reality. But for my purpose, what actually matters against a relative claim is to the extent that you believe this was going on before, aging should change that dynamic, right? So this is the kind of scope condition of what I'm saying. And next post, you have this economic voting literature that says governments that do poorly, going back to the 1960s, Louis Beck and colleagues, governments that do poorly get penalized in the next election. Now here I introduce something a bit different, which is heterogeneous economic voting. The idea is quite simple. Again, if I'm 20, I'm at university, and house prices are not increasing as much as I want, that's one problem. If I'm 60 and in a public sector job and unemployment is going up, that doesn't affect me, right? So even if you're in that materialist framework, and some could legitimately say that we shouldn't be, but even if you are, then it isn't the case that you should have a homogeneous response function, right? Not every voter should respond to an economic shock the same way. And so here, crucially, what I want to introduce is this asymmetric response function. I'm just saying, let's look at how, and I have to move on because then I want to be able to show you any empirics, but what I'm claiming here is that you should have different kind of voting behavior on the part of different economic groups. Okay, then you have the preference leg. We know that people, I'm positing that certain age groups are more or less bothered about different kinds of policies and economic priorities. We have something about why parties in turn could be expected to pick that up. And here I want to think about how that then shape policies in a way that affect the economy, right? I've come up with one that's sort of relatively well known in literature, a mechanism. There's another two that are slightly more novel, I think. The one that's well known is the crowding out. If I spend a lot on pensions, maybe there's not so much money left for other things. What are those things? Well, things that have diffused gains in the very long term, and that people have very little information about, right? These are the kind of three characteristics of policies that get a bit forgotten often. Notice that climate change is, in a lot of ways, meeting those characteristics. But there's another two possibilities here. One is excess prioritization. Maybe this thing is really, really important to 30% of my electorate. And since governments have limited attention and limited tools, and so do voters, we really focus on that one thing at the exclusion of anything else. And the third one is what I call unaccountability, right? And by that I mean that if you think again of the Iverson and Soski's book, at the end they say democracy and capitalism, they're compatible because the middle class, essentially, which is highly educated and productive, they want growth, and so they penalize governments that don't have growth, and so in that view, democracy reinforces capitalist efficiency, and capitalist efficiency reinforces democracy, and you have a happy kind of middle-class democracy symbiosis going on. And I think that's right, historically, but only if large parts of the electorate actually care a lot about growth and human capital investment and other kinds of investment. If they don't, then you might be in trouble. Notice here that this is not any kind of, there's nothing biological about the argument, right, that I'm making. This is purely about the position of people in the economic structure. If suddenly tomorrow we change the economic structure, you could have people who are much older have a complete shift of preferences as they probably did 60, 70 years ago. Okay, so this is the kind of schematized, simplified version of what I'm saying here. I'm not going to belabor that part of the point further. Instead, oops, I don't think it should be here. Instead, what I want to say here, which I did not think was here, but what I want to say here is that you don't need very much share of the elderly to have something quite significant in the electorate, right? So this looks complicated, it's quite simple. You fix the share of the elderly participation at different rates. Here you have the share of the elderly population, and here you see how much the working age voters are voting, right? And what you can see here is that if you have a very high elderly participation, say 80%, which is actually not implausible in terms of what you see, and you have about 20% of the population in the elderly category, again, it's not a number that's completely out of what we're having, and you have a working age participation which is lower, say around 50%. Again, look at the US or the UK, it's not that shocking. You have 1/3 on average already if you define elderly as above 65, right? And this is not telling you about the distribution. So this is purely hypothetical modeling, but just to show you that it's not something completely implausible. And here, this is the case of the US. This is age groups. This is whether or not, total Republican Democrats. And you see in the different elections, the composition of the electorate here. And you see that basically, over 50% is above 50 in both cases, but there's a tilt in the Republicans. It's larger. And I suspect it would be probably even more pronounced in the UK in terms of the partisan demographic cleavage there. So, I think that also alerts you that, great power is not equal regardless of parties. Okay. So I've made a lot of, in some ways, straightforward, in other ways, big claims involving a lot of different legs and parts. I just want to show you some evidence. Cathie had said between 30 and 40 minutes. I'm going to interpret the latter as being my target, if the chair will allow me. I just want to summarize what I'm going to show you now. What I want to show you is that it is indeed the case that the elderly favor so-called consumption policies such as pensions more than so-called social investment policies such as education and childcare. And it is indeed the case that in country elections, where inflation is high, they really punish the government at the ballot box. But in cases where unemployment is high or growth is low, no difference in the probability of voting for the incumbent, right? So it's about what gets you up in the morning of an election and what makes you vote for or against the person. Now, obviously, you have long-standing partisan commitments as well that are going to play into this, but on average, some people are swing voters and they're going to behave differently. Then I want to show you that indeed governments in country and periods where you have more elderly, they spend more on pensions, not very surprising, but they also spend less on education and family policy, and they also spend less on labor market policies, but in a conditional way that I won't cover, but I can tell you more about it. The inflation part of the argument you suffered through already in the reading is the claim that the countries with older people have low inflation and indeed higher so-called central bank independence. I think the more important claim here for people who are not obsessing over price, although the article is topical 4 years too late, too early in a sense, now GDP growth, no one cares, it's inflation, but anyways, c'est la vie. But I'm going to show you that countries that have higher shares of elderly have lower growth rates. Okay. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking a lot of cross-national surveys that cover all of Europe and in some cases also the US and Japan and other advanced economies, and have literally hundreds of questions about what people think, about what kind of policies governments should spend more money on, what they should change, what they shouldn't change, and so on and so forth. And then I'm using quantitative methods, statistical methods, to estimate the probability that someone wants something, right? So it's almost like public opinion, as a function of their age and most other things that we know matter a lot to preference formation. Typically, income, class, education, gender, and so on and so forth. We can talk about that later. I don't want to bore you with the methods further, except to say that in all the graphs, you're going to see a coefficient that shows you the effect of age, a coefficient that shows you the effect of being 60 plus, 65 plus, or being a retired person, right? So we have different ways of getting at the same kind of argument. This is a bit of an eye test, I apologize. What you're seeing here, this is on political behavior. I'm just going to walk you through it. The elderly are more likely to have voted in last election. They're more likely, in some cases, to have participated in demonstrations. They're more likely to have signed a petition. Less likely to disagree that they have a strong understanding in political issues, less likely to say that they're not interested in politics, and less likely to say that they're not interested in politics, but from a different survey. And so here we're just corroborating the findings and the method. We find what we already know. People who are older, much more on the ball when it comes to politics, as an average claim. How do we feel about the situation? It used to be 60s, 70s, most of Europe, pensioners were actually a relatively poor category, right? This is no longer the case. It's been documented in England, it's been documented in France. I know less about the UK's case, we could talk about other cases. These are subjective measures, not objective measures. It's likely I do not have enough money to cover my household necessities in the next 12 months. Less likely when you're older. It's easy for me to borrow money if I get into financial difficulties, credit market access. More likely, I feel that it is difficult on my present income. Less likely to save it. How does that then shape what they care about? Well, interestingly enough, they do think, on average, the standard of living of pensioners is good. And they also, but when it comes to changing that in any way that would hurt it, I mean, materialism is not completely wrong, rational choice is not dead. They're more likely to disagree that the government should lower the statutory retirement age, more likely to disagree that the government should cut back on pensions to finance more spending on education and families, less likely to think that they should spend less on retirement, less likely that government should not be responsible for the standard of living of the elderly. Right? Again, here, to be honest, this has been documented. I think it's been debated, and that's why I'm trying to get at it with like several different surveys and different proxies, just to get a sense whether on average it's a reasonable assumption to make. On labor market policies, I won't read you everything, but what I'll say is that actually when it comes to the benefits of the unemployed, the elderly are not less supportive, but they are less likely to support, they're more likely, pardon me, to be against government financing projects to create new jobs, right? So unemployment benefits, you can protect them, but don't spend money on creating new jobs. They also think that government should be responsible for standard of living. This one is interesting. Government should keep down unemployment and not inflation. You know, if you assume a trade-off, which is common in most central banks, for instance, they side on the side of inflation. Depending on how you operationalize it, it changes a little bit. Education policy preferences, state of education, no effect. Less likely to think that it's government responsibility to provide childcare and services for working parents. This is an average across a bunch of countries across many years. For sure, in certain countries at certain times it would flip, right? So, I mean, I don't want to overplay this argument either. Governments should spend less on education, more likely to say so as well. Okay, so we have this picture very quickly, very roughly, of what it is, of the nature of the cleavage. Is the cleavage sufficiently strong? Does it matter for politics? Is it stronger than other cleavages, right? I mean, these are the things that we need to think about when thinking about these things, to think about whether or not it's plausible that it translates. So here what I do is I use this super survey which we use. I'm just mentioning it in case you're thinking of thesis projects, and it's always good to say, hey, look into this. This is something that combines a lot of electoral surveys across a bunch of countries. We have 71 country election years in 21 countries, 97 to 2015. And here, respondents ask, who did you vote for? And you can check whether they voted for the incumbent or not, controlling for their left-right placement, controlling for other covariates, other things that affect their behaviors. And then what we can do, which is what economic voting literature does, is say, okay, when you're in a situation which is quite bad in the economy, do you penalize the government more or less than when you're not, right? So if the economy is booming, do you love the government? And if the economy is tanking, do you think, oh, wow, these guys are really incompetent, I need to get rid of them? Maybe the latter would be something that should happen more often. But anyways, here what we do is we say, let's look at what happens when GDP growth is going up, when unemployment rate is going up, when inflation is going up, house price is going up. Okay. And then what we're trying to do is to say, does it make you less or more likely to vote for the government? I mean, again, there are lots of caveats one could discuss when doing these sorts of exercises, but for my purpose, what's important and what's heartening, just looking at the 65 versus not 65 category here, is that you can see that indeed people who are under 65 care a bit more in who they vote for in terms of GDP growth. People who are 65 plus, not really responsive to unemployment. By the way, I mean, this looks like nothing, but we have 50 years of literature suggesting that voters should punish governments that have high inflation, high unemployment, right? I mean, this is a relatively consistent finding in economic voting. You see it here a bit better as well, in a way that actually makes sense. If you're studying, it doesn't matter so much. If you're 65 plus, doesn't matter so much. If you're middle-aged, matters a lot. You could also look at other slicing, what kind of job you have and so on. We can talk about that. House prices here, people who are young don't care so much. In fact, if they're like me in Oxford trying to buy a house, they should punish the government for house prices increase, but they don't. So there you go, at least on average. And here you see people reward this. Not much difference there also on house prices it's a bit noisy. So we've seen the preferences, we've seen the electoral behavior. I'm at 40 minutes. I just want to show you some policies and some economic growth now. So what do I do here is I collect data for 21 OECD countries, but I've also tried with a bigger sample. I like having countries that are relatively similar. I don't like stretching things too much, and having 80 countries that are completely different in lots of ways we can't account for. And we have data from 60s, 70s, depending a bit what we're looking at, up until 2015, 2018, 2020. Here we have the relatively standard way of doing it is to minimize the squared residuals, to minimize the error in prediction in the way our model works, and we estimate coefficients like this, ordinary least square. To be honest, I'm going to show you very simple coefficients, very basic ones, because I'm old school and I believe that you have to start with very simple estimates first. But I just want to kind of signal that I've tried a bunch of different things. You can try different dependent variables, you can try different standard errors, you can try different fixed effect structures, lags, periods, all sorts of models we can talk about in the Q&A. If you're interested in it, doesn't change the results. So here, what do we find here? We have old age spending, public spending on education, spending on family policies. You can weigh them in lots of different ways. Again, we can talk about that in the Q&A if you're into this sort of stuff. But what you find is that the share of the elderly is positively correlated with old age spending. 1 percentage point in the share of elderly increase associated with 0.5 more or less percentage point old age spending as a percentage of GDP. That's a relatively massive effect, considering we're absorbing all temporal and geographical unobservable heterogeneity here, and that we have a number of controls such as union density, left control of the government, other things you could reasonably think matter, trade openness, the financial market, we're controlling for these sorts of things. Here we see on public spending on education, spending on family policy, again, negative and statistically significant. The higher the share of the elderly, the lower the spending on these things. However, the effect is a bit less strong, and that makes sense. You could try it differently as well to see what happens. Okay. Last but not least, real GDP growth and the share of the elderly. Again, here, before I show you any more advanced statistics, I just want to show you what it looks like descriptively, because in fact, when I started this project, what got me into it was a very descriptive, shocking kind of visual view, and I still remember it. It was Saturday night. I was watching a French political TV show, which is something very French, because on Saturday night it's prime time, and normally you don't have TV shows, but in France you do. And on it, you had our favorite Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who was leader of the left-wing front, left of the left, the drill. And he said, in that context, the Germans, they're obsessing over inflation, but that's normal. It's because they're old and we're a young nation and we need to care about other things. And at the time, I had the feeling that most people have, when they exposed to this project. I thought at the same time it was a completely outrageous claim, but also that it probably is true. And so I did what any reasonable person would do, and I looked at data on my laptop to check what was the correlation. And it's got something similar as what I'm showing you for real GDP growth, but it was with inflation. And so here you see it purely cross-sectionally. So you have an average. This is the average for 21 OECD countries in the early 60s. This is the average for 21 OECD countries in 2010. We're capturing purely the temporal dimension, right? But obviously, these things could be trending in the same ways for reasons that are completely unrelated to aging. It's a bit like cheese consumption, and nuclear weapons. You plot them together, and they're going up in the 80s. Does it mean the two are causally related? No, of course not, or hopefully not. Here you see it cross-nationally. This is the average 1960 to 2014, 54 years. You take that average, you collapse the data, and then you plot the countries, and you see again, same thing, countries that are older tend to have lower real GDP growth. I should have said that. This is the real GDP growth here. This is the share of the elderly on this. Hopefully the fact that it was 14 here gave it away, but it wasn't, unfortunately. GDP growth. Okay, here, what I do is I first run real GDP growth on the share of the elderly with nothing else in it, right? Empty model. You have a negative coefficient, 0.3, a whopping 30% R squared. Just going to pause here purely descriptively. 30% of the distribution in real GDP growth is accounted for. Notice I'm not using the word explain, is accounted for by the variation in the share of the elderly. You include controls, it shrinks, but not so much, and you see a 30% increase in the explanatory power in the model, and then you can include other things and do all sorts of tests, but I leave that to the Q&A. This is something fun which we can talk about later. Okay, so why have you suffered for 5 minutes of me talking, especially if you don't care about aging and you don't care too much about growth? I mean, if you really don't care about growth, we're in trouble. But why does it matter? First of all, I think it's a kind of classic political economy stab at the economist to just tell them again, if need be, I know people here in this room have been telling them for a while, hey, look, you can't understand the economy if you completely disregard politics, right? Politics matter. Point number one. Point number two, which I think is quite interesting, is that there's long-run changes in the institutions. Your reading for This Week looks at it, DOC and so on. But these don't just affect the economy, they affect the electorate in a way that affects policy, in a way that affects the economy, right? So there's something going on with slow-moving changes in the electorate that we're not really paying attention to. Point number three, the crisis of the welfare state with aging is even worse than anticipated. Typically, we say, oh my gosh, how are we going to pay for all these people? But now it's worse than that, because it's not only, oh my gosh, how are we going to pay for all these people? It's also an economic problem through the direct economic way, but also politically, we have no easy solution, right? Because we don't have a constituency that could build the foundation to promote investments, right? Last but not least, and I mentioned that a few times, to the extent that you believe there's a symbiotic relationship between democracy and capitalism, and as the son of a former Trotskyist, it's always difficult for me to completely buy it, to the extent that you do, and that you buy the Iverson and Soskis line, which is probably the best, or one of the best treatments on this, I think the conditions under which that happens are being undermined by aging. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much. I'm going to make a few points to kick us off, and then I'd love to hear questions from the audience. And I particularly want to encourage students to volunteer to go first on these questions. So you guys be thinking about what kind of questions you want to pose. So I love this paper and this work more broadly. I think it's really important. There's this broader social cleavage that in a sense is hiding in plain sight. And I find it fascinating how the preferences of the elderly versus younger people echo across economic and social policy areas. So a lot of what we do in political science is we look at deals made in specific policy areas, policy legacies, and what you're identifying here are broad trends that cut across policy areas, and that's super interesting to me. I also think it's methodologically brilliant. The individual level analysis and data line up beautifully with the meso level Pardee incentives and macro level policy outcomes. So I think that's super interesting. And I think the work is going to make a crucial contribution to our understanding of comparative political economy. I think it's also extremely important to our cooperative capacities to solve collective action problems, because when we talk about solving collective action problems, we have to think about how these cleavages matter, and this is super interesting. So just a couple of questions to kick us off. So one question is, does the age cleavage trump the cross-national differences in party systems and other political institutional variation? So a familiar argument in comparative politics is that PR systems have better family policies, for example, than majoritarian systems. PR systems have better social investment policies than majoritarian systems. Programmatic parties and multi-party systems have more cradle-to-grave policies and less distinctions among generations. And those are all things that we believe. So my question is, in your work, do you find cross-national variation in elder power along the party dimension? I think you mentioned at some point that the Republicans in America half of them are above 65, whereas in the Democratic Party it's a much smaller amount. I have another question, and actually that gets me back to this slide here where you're looking at distribution of among countries. If you can you pull the slide back?
Yeah.
Yeah, this one. And so I think this is kind of what I'm suggesting, because you got these countries here at the bottom that have fairly high amounts of social spending, and yet on their scale, it seems like they're not the ones that you would anticipate. They have lower GDP growth rates, and so you might think that these are the loser countries that aren't benefiting them so much, and yet I saw the statistic that Sweden spends 6 times as much on the elderly as on kids, where in the United States it's 39%. So is there a kind of differentiation between these broad GDP growth rates and some of the intra-welfare state allocation of resources? One of the reasons in America we spend so much on the elderly is because of healthcare. So I also wondered about the healthcare dimension. I have another question on policy consequences. And that is, actually that's a question I just asked, so I don't have to ask it. It gets me to a broader point, this issue about policy consequences, and that is, does the distribution among programs look different in countries with high and low percentages of the elderly? So could you look at a country and say, this is what we see, and in the social policy regime we would expect to find this distribution. So just wondering how you would reconcile some of these truisms we have about cross-national differences and some of the broad empirical relationships that you see. So I don't know if you want to answer that now or if you want me to gather a couple questions.
I mean, the inclination with fantastic questions is always to take more, so you can hide behind others. But I'm just gonna say thank you first of all, because it's really fantastic and stimulating. So that's one thing I wanted to say. The second one, because it's sort of more straightforward to mention it for me at this stage, is on healthcare. I don't think it's so clear cut.
Yeah.
And I think the reason is that my healthcare measure picks up too many different things, right? So I mean, it's not that all healthcare only matters, to the elderly. I mean, healthcare matters too. I mean, first of all, when it first emerged, sickness and industrial accidents. But I suppose I think the really bigger point, which is really difficult for me to satisfactorily answer, but which we can start thinking about and answer a little bit, and then we can see how it comes up also in the discussion, is the point about how this relates to classic CP typologies. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, in a way, part of me, when I started this project, I thought this is really an over time kind of situation, right? So people start in different places, they have different institutions, strengths and weaknesses, and over time, they're all facing this challenge. It might even be that they're more or less well placed to manage it, or that depending on the kind of political compromise they have, right, it plays out differently. And I think this is one way of kind of handling a very important question. Does it trump other long-standing variation? I wouldn't want to overplay it. Although, interestingly enough, as you raised the question, I thought the CMEs were precisely those that had been, quote-unquote, proven to be able to perform better, right? And they did in terms of inflation, mm-hmm. but maybe not for the reasons we thought. But then in terms of growth, you really see quite low levels of growth. Now, is this despite this large social investment or not? I think is a good question. I'm hesitating how much to slice it in a sense, right? Because I do think I could try and split the countries, LMEs, CMEs, maybe MMEs in the middle, and then rerun it. But then almost automatically I would have mostly an overtime dimension. The alternative, I think, would then be, I'm thinking aloud here, to see whether you have a conditional correlation between the share of the elderly depending on some index of coordination that precedes it. And I think this is something I should definitely try to look into. I want to say more, but I want to open up the audience, and I have to think about it a bit more.
And I think the CMAs also differ because Germany, of course, fits your model beautifully, where there's so much emphasis on the elderly, whereas the Nordic countries are a little bit different, and maybe maybe part of this high growth rate in places like the U.S. has to do with the bubbles of the early 21st century. But anyway, questions? Yes.
Yeah, hi. My name is Jane. Since we were just kind of talking about Germany, that like leads into my question pretty well. But it's mostly for like the wider implications. So say like there was like a certain percentage of young people in Germany, and they're like recognizing and like being aware, becoming aware of this pattern related to like inflation and like the elderly's participation in like the electoral system. Why would I, like as a young person, not go somewhere maybe that's got a lower percentage of elderly people and kind of migrate to somewhere that, like a country maybe that's got a wider, or like for the question, like a lower percentage of the elderly that's influencing politics.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it did make sense. Thanks so much. Yes.
Okay. Any
I
more
think-
students? Any more students want to raise their
Indeed.
hand? Yes.
Hi,
Introduce yourself. Yeah.
I'm Estelle, I'm a first year PhD student. I kind of wanted to ask you if you could expand maybe the very last point of your presentation on how capitalism and democracy could be affected, how democracy could be negatively affected by aging. That's what I understood. Because I thought maybe it was a bit counterintuitive and like I imagine that like older people like in France, they would tend to vote for right parties, or even like Macron, who is like economically as well on the right side. So to me, it felt like they are feeding capitalism. So
Let me get one more. Let's let
Good
Bill
question.
Grimes
Thank
jump
you.
in, and then maybe you can answer these.
Yeah.
So I have two questions, but first just to clarify, the GDP, is that the real GDP, is that real GDP per capita?
So I've tried it both overall and per capita.
Okay, so because that should make a pretty big difference, and you notice that most of the countries on the left side, on the upper piece, were countries of immigration, or in the case of Japan, since you're running back to 1960, there was still rapid population growth. So I was assuming, I couldn't really tell, but so the other piece, so one question is, shouldn't long-run GDP figures track more with catch-up, economic catch-up, than with this aging question? Did you account for that? In other words, right? So the U.S. is, since what, 1890 has had a rough real per capita GDP growth rate of 2.3%. But countries that are behind have typically had higher rates. So that's just sort of one question: is how do you manage that little data piece? Totally different question: structured pensions. So in the United States, so a lot of us don't have what you would call a pension. Most of us have funded individualized pensions. So like I personally, I'm not quite at that age yet, although you said I should be voting that way because I'm over 50. But I should care a lot more about GDP growth because it should translate into profits than I care about inflation.
Order. So I think the structure of the pension is a really important one. I mean, it's an important one in a kind of pure, is this conditional in an empirical way, right? But I actually think it's even more important theoretically for the following reason, right? I think the point I'm making is actually, it's almost a counterfactual case to the US, right? Because the point I'm making is not that there's something intrinsic about someone being 50 or 60 or 70, right? So it's not a generational or life cycle argument. It's purely a kind of the extent to which my material livelihood is a function of whatever's going on and what that is. So inflation affects me. I care a lot about inflation. Other things might not. Therefore, I don't, right? And so therefore, it has to be even in a system indeed where if it was indeed the case that the stock market perfectly tracked GDP growth, or indeed, I say, nominal wage development in the long run, I'm thinking of the US case and the middle and bottom income groups. I have colleagues, Brian Nolan and others, looking at this median and bottom income over time in the US. It's been stagnating. But in a way, that's not an issue, I think, for my theoretical argument. I think what is an issue, and what I haven't done enough of, and this is where I think it's important I have to do it, is precisely think of these counterfactual cases, right? Think of cases well placed differently. Because it could be that the US behaves differently because they have, quote unquote, less elderly people, but it's not really the case. Or it could be that in the US, in fact, it is a case of what happens when the elderly livelihood depends on economic performance in some kind of way. I think I would want to do the test on the stock market, if the stock market is where the pensions are, rather than like work my way through the GDP growth. But in the very long run, to be honest, I mean, it is the case that GDP growth eventually will kick into society, right? So I'm assuming some discount on the part of people as well. Because if I'm living another 50 years from 50 to 100, I don't want the economy to collapse, because then eventually the pensions are going to collapse and there's going to be a riot in the streets, right? So there's got to be scope conditions, I think, from there. So, but taking the structure of pensions into account, I think is well taken. The first one was more technical. So I've tried real GDP growth. I've tried GDP per capita logarithmic. I've also tried, following Acemoglu's recent QJE piece, on a similar topic, dynamic panel, right, where you model current GDP change as a function of past one. So you kind of neutralize whatever starting position you have, and the effects stay from that side. So I think that's going on. A bigger issue, if I can be quite honest with the struggles of the project, is how do I neutralize the purely economic effect? One thing I tried is to slice democracies versus non-democracies, because my reasoning is if it's a pure political effect, it should be stronger in democracies. And I do find that, but obviously democracies and non-democracies are different in many ways, right? So it's really difficult to neutralize the purely economic channel, and I struggle a bit with that. Okay, Estelle, is that correct? Yes? Yes. Really good question about the relationship between democracy and aging and so on. So it is the case that, I mean, the elderly are more conservative with a small c, not too much change on average. They support democratic institutions. They're less likely to vote for, although I was going to say less likely to vote for populist forces. That used to be true, but not so much anymore. But the point that I'm making is simply that if you do believe, as I do to some extent, but not completely, that there was a part of the middle class which penalized economically incompetent or sub-performing governments before, and that this kept governments doing, quote unquote, what they should do so that capitalism works well. And if you do believe that democracy then depended on capitalism working well, and again, this is the Iverson and Soski's line, not mine, I suppose, then I think that argument has a scope condition in it that the majority or politically powerful part of the electorate is fulfilling that function, and I no longer believe, or I'm not sure it's the case, let's put it more mildly, still now, when a sizable share of the electorate, perhaps with the exception of the US, I have to think about that more, is no longer dependent on this. And what happens then? Well, what happens then is that the groups that are systematically ignored rebel. They go out of the political system, or they vote for parties that are disruptive. So if I wanted to overstretch the implications of my argument slightly, I would say maybe, this stagnation then leads to a backlash, right? And it's often not, rich people who fulfill it, or it's an alliance of nationalist rich people who've left behind. Let's put it this way, and we can talk about that more. And last but not least, the young in Germany, for instance, voice or exit, right? So it's a trade-off everyone has. There's good work on migration showing that the certain conditions people decide to take their bags and go elsewhere. Mine is certainly not a call for young people to exit gerontocratic societies, but I do think there's something interesting, right? Because there's something about the intergenerational pact here that's going on, right? And it's not expressing itself in a kind of official way, right? So it's not that my parents, who are lovely people, tell me I don't care about what's happening for you. They care a lot, and they think that a government that doesn't deliver the goods for me is not a performing government. But the question is, do they behave the same way as if I cut the European institutions' generous pensions, by 20%, as if I don't invest in active labor market policies. So that's the crucial test, right? It's not whether people declare, I care about a lot of things, but where do I put my money? Where do I put politically my activism? Whether or not young people then should voice or exit the country, I think, is a personal decision that I wouldn't comment on, but it's a good question.
Okay, so Vivian has a question, and students, I want you guys to speak up.
So I think this is a wonderful talk and lots of really important information. So I'd just like to go around the edges because you've actually answered lots of the questions about elderly, democracy, capitalism. But I wonder if there might be other factors also at play. Immigration. To what extent does immigration, just the fact of immigration, play on the sort of the politics that you've described? But once we go into politics, and what I find interesting is that your discussion of politics is, although you do critique lots of the literature, which I think is excellent, and you also critique the rationalist approach. You're using surveys. Nonetheless, it seems to me it downplays the importance of ideas. You did mention the populists, but to what extent do messages make a difference? To what extent do the elderly vote in one way because they're captivated by the culture wars, and therefore don't consider the economic consequences for their kids? So that's one piece, and the other is, and I think you kind of answered this, is when you talked about pushback. What we have seen is that there's now a move to unionize again. So this is so I wonder about unionization, youth movements. Think about Greta Thunberg and climate change. To what extent can that have an effect on the elderly vote? Because you seem to dismiss entirely real politics, which is the politics of messaging, beyond the real politics of economics. But in a way, it seems to me, even though you say you want to push back against the economists, you end up with more of an economists-like argument by saying the elderly vote their purse. Do they? And part of the problem here is that this is at such a macro level in terms of surveys and large, that in a way I'm asking you to give me more micro information, differences amongst countries, transnational comparisons, but also deeply into, say, France, say the US, etc. And that might be another phase, or you might want to take case studies to actually test this, to see to what extent other factors may be at play that you can't get from the large quantitative studies.
Okay, so while you're thinking about that set of questions, anybody else want to weigh in here? Yes.
Hi, I'm Abraham. I think I'm just gonna ask, how does I see the way that the elderly share has the ability to change or to influence is from the fact that they are very highly participative in political events in relative to the younger generation. But I was thinking how is it works within the elderly group? In a way, I was thinking is there a sort of quadratic function in a way that as you get older, you are sort of more powerful, more influential. But then certain age, you'll get less and less and less. Because I was thinking well, if I'm a 50-year-old, I might have this and that sort of consideration and the ability to sort of assert what I want. But if let's say I'm 150-year-old, will I go to an actual voting ballot? Will I actually care what's going on TV and radio? If I'm 200 years old, let's say, in some sort of hypothetical argument, do me or on average any people within that age range have any ability to sort of influence economic or political activity? That's what I would ask.
Thanks, Abraham. Anybody else want to come in? Yes.
Hi, Hi, I'm Sabrina. I really enjoyed your presentation. It was really interesting. But I was wondering, I know that you mentioned that you didn't really focus on the relationship between public opinion and like the actual government institutions themselves. But I was wondering if you could offer maybe some like empirical explanation to, I guess, the ways that central banks and governments have responded to the public opinion of the electorate with respect to inflation in the past, especially just because I feel like in recent years, it wasn't really at the forefront of the policy agenda until it became really pressing, like this past year. So yeah.
Okay, you want to take that set of
Great, yeah,
questions and-
thanks so much. I mean, I'll take them in reverse order. They're all fantastic questions. I mean, the first one, CBI, public opinion, inflation, I think is really important. I remember one of my former, more critical supervisors, whom colleagues here will know, Untitled Chapter, when she heard about this paper, the inflation paper, she said, that doesn't make any sense because how would the electorate have any impact on inflation anyways? It's all independent. And I think that I think is the crux of the matter. I happen to think that in the longer run, institutions are politicized and they're endogenous, but crucially, and that's a kind of a 10% response to Vivian already, I believe that's the case without having to depart ontologically or epistemologically from a notion that material interest matter at least to some extent independently, and that you can formalize the effect. So in a way, mine is a challenge from within. You could think of it as an entrism of rational choice. I believe they might be right. I believe that even if they're right about the methods and the assumptions that are made, that it's still the case that you could challenge the conclusions that they draw. So I think this is where I'm getting at. And what that means for inflation and CBI, and this is some work I'm doing with Bob Hanke, it's not yet out. And we're looking at the coalition in support of low inflation. And the elderly is part of it, but they're not big enough historically to have pushed for that agenda. And our view is what happens is that you have the elderly group who care a lot about inflation, and then you have a large group of workers who are in permanent contracts and are relatively shielded from unemployment. And as a result of that makes it possible for governments to even delegate this conservative monetary policy to independent central banks. Now, at the time, the conventional wisdom is ideas and structural constraints. The economists saw the light and they understood that you can have low inflation and so free lunch, and therefore governments on this particular occasion believe them because of stagflation, and so they delegate monetary policy. But as we're seeing now, the idea wasn't even convincing on its own terms because we have independent central banks now and conservative monetary policy, and inflation is skyrocketing. And what do governments do? Suddenly, the mandates are being challenged. And why are they being challenged, despite the institutionalization? Because the electorates are turning against it. So it's the dog that didn't bark, but not for the reason that we thought it was. It wasn't the institution delegation. It was that you had a broad coalition. At least that's my reading, right? But I mean, it's not, I should say, because you're studying this is not the conventional wisdom on the topic, by and large. Okay. Then we go to Abraham. Elderly power goes up. Are there differences with the elderly group? I think that's a very stimulating and spot-on comment for the following reason. For sure, my grandmother, to go back to her because I love her very much, who's 100 years old, doesn't go out to vote, or is not writing letters all day long to her representatives, right? So yes, it's quadratic, but I think what your comment made me think about and realize is that it's again a voice and exit kind of situation, right? If I'm 50, 60, 70, it's a voice. I can go and mobilize, I have resources, both temporal and material, and maybe particular views as well, and I can vote. If I'm above that, I think we're back in the unaccountability idea that I had there, which is that I'm exited from the I might not even vote after 70 or most probably 85, right? After 85, at some point, maybe you're like, okay, that's enough, I do something else. But what does that do? Yes, you have other people who don't vote, But these people, when starvation kicks in, they go in the streets, and you have the kinds of protests we've seen in countries a while back that were really underperforming. And it wasn't people who were 85 in the street; it was people who were 25 to 45 to a large extent, right? Because they had more physical means of doing so, right? And so I think again it's the penalty function of the government. I'm thinking a lot about this political analysis, which then leads me to Vivienne, very, very stimulating and difficult questions. I think there's a bit which enters my framework more possibly, which is the bit about migration that I have to think about. But when I think about migration, what I think about is again, I think it's a different version of a similar kind of argument. I'm thinking of UAEs. So what happens in a society's performance and economic policy priorities where the majority of its population is disenfranchised? So we're back in the 85 plus kind of version of the argument, unaccountability, right? No one is keeping me on my knees. Now there's a more empirical challenge, which is what if all this stuff is an artifact of migration having a positive economic effect, as it does in the vast majority of cases, more migration, younger population, more growth, nothing to do with great power. This is not something I have checked, and so I just need to go and do my homework on this one. I think that comes to the ideational challenge, which is much more difficult for me to handle. I guess I gave you a little bit of an answer on the fourth point you made, which is, am I out economisting the economist? And I think if it is the economist that believed that it was the monetarist papers that led to the emergence of monetarism in the 80s, I certainly don't agree with them. I think the gold standard had been in existence for 150 years. There had been lots of times where it was very compelling, and it wasn't taken up either in the electorate or by the government elites. So when it comes to monetarism, which I've looked at a bit more, I don't think it was just the idea. Now, of course, I wouldn't be someone who would say it's completely irrelevant if you have no compelling narrative, right? Because that would, I just think would be unreasonable, right? For sure, you need to have messaging, you need to have compelling ideas. My question is more to look at the rationalist material foundations of it, right? To the extent that they exist, right? So I'm in the kind of a kind of pluralist camp with a division of labor where I focus on the extent to which material dynamics might matter. It could be that they don't matter at all, but I find that implausible because that would mean that these material factors I'm looking at are correlated with ideas in a way that so happens to give me these sorts of patterns that I'm seeing. Now, I think what I agree with you, though, is on the call for case study. Because indeed, not just people who believe or focus more on ideas more than I do, but I think many other people who also do quite political science, they would say, hang on a minute, show me the dynamic in a country. Show me how it played out in this particular election. So I'm thinking about it. I think we might need to discuss more bilaterally about how that would look like in the UK case. But I think the pushback is very interesting, the question of the pushback. But for me, the pushback fits within the framework, right? Yes, obviously you need a populist idea to be existing for that pushback to materialize and to be effective. Otherwise, you could just have disenchantment, or you could just have migration out of the country, right? But okay, I know it's not totally satisfactory, but I still have to think, yes, culture wars. Culture wars, do they vote against their interest? Well, I don't know again. I guess that's what I'm thinking about. What's your interest? I think if I think of hard interest, Brexit, catastrophe, up until the inflation shock, I'm above 65. My pension is triple locked in the UK. I have house prices that are booming like it's party time every day. Maybe my children, if I'm from a good class background in the public sector or they're in insider jobs in large companies, I'm pretty insulated. It might be that I think, I think the way ideas come in is when I think, but my children is not doing well, and that the Conservative Party tells me it's because of EU regulations. There I do believe there's a construction of what people think. But where I think it doesn't work is if I cut your pension by 50% or the house market crashes, then you penalize who's in power, right? I mean, you can't blame shift something that big, right? So I'm thinking of these extreme counterfactual conditions, but again, I remain open to debate.
Okay, does anybody have any final questions? Yes, Matthew.
Hello, I'm Matthew. I had a quick question, if you wouldn't mind, about sort of the effects of generational inequalities or the inequality between generations on this model. Specifically asking about how big of a priority kind of reducing inflation would be if there was diminished economic opportunities for younger generations, or if this would be kind of a collective action problem that would more older generations be able to mobilize more and gain more political power, or if that priority would kind of shift depending on like the gravity of that issue.
Okay, Debbie, did you have a question?
I did kind of one little empirical one and then one about kind of the implications. So I might have missed this in the covariates, but we know that secular trends in educational attainment mean that countries that have a higher share elderly also skew lower education, and likewise each subsequent cohort coming through is more racially and ethnically diverse. So I'm wondering how country level educational attainment and then diversity along whatever ethnic, racial, religious group is predominant in those societies. So that was just a little clarification question. My other question is just about the interpretation, right? Do you have any concerns that these kind of results might perpetuate generational conflicts, for instance, and perpetuation of myths of the greedy geezers and neglect of the fact that older adults are in unpaid labor force in terms of volunteering, grandchild care, etc. So I'd like to just hear a little bit about kind of if this got written up in the Wall Street Journal, what the spin might be and how you might think about countering that.
Thank you.
And I think you had, I'm sorry, what is your name, please?
I'm Shina Choi. So I would actually, first of all, thank you so much for sharing your fascinating papers, so your research. So actually, I'm so glad to hear that you have a centenary grandma in your family. That's really so fortunate.
Thank you.
So. And then actually, my question about, I'm very curious of one of your key findings about the consumption and the social investment. And then you mentioned that actually the elder, especially old elders, very focused on the consumption, favoring consumption rather than social investment. Do you think it only apply for old elders or even other generation, or just like young elders or even other age groups? So I just want to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. Wow, I mean, all great questions. Thanks so much. So I'll take the last one last. I mean, in my model, and there's a lot of great work on social investment and consumption policies, which in some ways is much more encompassing and exhaustive and maybe also more complex than my framework, right? My framework is purely to think about two dimensions, right? One is what's the likelihood that this will affect my long-term well-being, right? So think social investment, it's a great thing for society, but a lot of people won't be around, right? It's the same issue we have with climate change. So if people tell me, well, we care about the long term all the time, I say, well, we can't even prevent the mass extinction of a society, so I doubt that we have the optimal amount on childcare spent for material reasons, right? I'm talking again about the material coalition here. I'm saying this tongue in cheek, obviously, but I think it's really difficult for people to project very, very long unless they think I might be around, right? Then there's the more immediate thing: am I beneficiary or not? This is pure, Pearson and others, and I'm just finding inspiration from that. So, long story short, I think the older you are, the more you care about policies that affect you, and in the present, the younger you are, the more you think also about policies that affect you, but also about the future, the dynamics of the country, right? So this is the framework. I don't think it captures everything, but I think it certainly captures, as far as I can tell, an important dimension. Then comes the question of, the excellent question about diversity, growing diversity in education. And I think that's not something I have given enough attention. I think it ties in from a different angle to the migration comment, right? Which is about composition, which is about thinking about how that shifts material dynamics, or indeed how that shifts prevailing ideas. And it's something that I think I haven't got my head around theoretically, first of all. And then I think empirically I'm not really doing it justice, so I have to think more about this one. But on the generational conflict and how it might be interpreted, I mean, I suppose I would say that fortunately, unfortunately, my media attention is not so It's not so substantial that I would be doing a front page in the Wall Street. But assuming this did happen, I think what I would say is that this is not an argument about, think of Terra Nova in France, who made this argument, oh my gosh, the elderly, they're so wealthy, they have all these things and you have nothing, you need to take it from them. I'm not making that argument, right? It's not an argument about people being well off or worse off. Although that could certainly be, if it was the case, that wouldn't be a problem, I guess, for my argument. But my argument is about how government priorities and policies affect different groups. To the extent that these groups are, one, self-interested to some extent, and two, materially affected again to some extent, right? So I don't even need them to be completely self-interested, and I don't even need them to be purely materialist in their preference formation, which I don't believe can be the case. I mean, realistically, it's not a reasonable ontology to think people are purely materially. I mean, that's not, but I think that to some extent, some of what they do has to do something like this. So am I worried about intergenerational conflict? I don't think, but the nature of the conflict here happens to be intergenerational. But I think the argument is not about. It's not an intrinsic conflict, if you know what I mean, right? So it's not that I think that someone who's old ontologically has to be at odds with someone who's young. It's purely a matter of a position in the capitalist economy for me, right? I mean, I take a bit of inspiration from David Rudder's works, Labor Market Insiders and Outsiders, how much you protect it from unemployment risk, and a bit of work also from my colleague Ben Ansel on assets, right? Mm-hmm. And how much that changes your welfare system. So it just happens that the elderly, by virtue of being elderly and by virtue of us being civilized societies with pension systems, are out of the labor market at some point. And they happen to have accumulated often more assets just through compounding, right? Not because they're more free. So I think that's what I would say, but I have to think of a framing that doesn't lead to that risk, because I can see how it could be mobilizing. And last but not least, Abraham. What's it, Abraham? No,
it was
Sabrina.
Matthew. Yeah, it was Matthew. Hi, Matthew.
Hi.
Can you? I have to find you here. Can you remind me generational inequality?
Yes, that was my.
That was you. Okay, great. So generational inequality and how to prioritize. Remind me very briefly.
So over time, like projections for like from generation to generation show that there's kind of less economic opportunity, like for more younger generations, and are delaying kind of like building up wealth and investment. And so then, would that disparity in opportunity affect the priorities of like reducing inflation over social investment?
Taylor rule, got you. So as you know, central banks have a Taylor rule, meaning they assign different weight in the response function of the interest rates to two kinds of problems that macroeconomic societies care about: the output gap, which leads to unemployment and stagnating wages, and inflation. Okay. So the way I think about it is that people in the economy, and as a function of their age and other characteristics, are differently affected by these two things. So I think of them almost as mini central banks, because it helps me clarify the thing. Obviously, unlike central banks, they don't have control over the interest rate or over other wonderful things that central banks are doing right now. But it does mean then that different people would have, if you ask them as a pure trade-off, different views as to what to prioritize. Because if you are jobless and there is no benefits, inflation rate is not your primary worry. Now, maybe there exists a value of inflation that will switch that, right? So if you go to 1,000,000%, that's so destabilizing that everyone starts thinking, hang on a minute. But within the inflation rates that we're dealing with, 5, 10%, this is not shocking by the historical standards. I don't enjoy it more than the next person. And as anyone who knows the UK academic system knows, my wage is certainly not well protected against inflation, because the unions bargain for it inefficiently. But c'est comme ça. And so I think therefore, how do we shift this? It's very difficult. I think this is exactly across the matter. My hunch is that what's going to happen is we're going to hit it hard, have a strong response function on an inflation rate that by and large is making our fiscal issues better, because we're monetizing the debt of countries. If you owe money to the bank is a fantastic thing, right? But we're going to hit it hard, and what's going to happen is what happened last time, Volker, Thatcher, and so on. It's going to increase unemployment, and who is it going to increase unemployment for? Entrants. And who are the entrants? Younger people. So apart from organizing and and voting, and indeed creating ideas, indeed, because politics is also an ideational thing, creating ideas to try and explain to people that this is not sustainable to a society where people who are between 18 and 30 have no livelihoods for 50-60% of them. It's going to be difficult. But take Greece. I mean, people in Greece, they cut the pensions. Yes, but unemployment rate for people 18-25 was 60-70%. I mean, that's not the same kind of hardship as a 10 or 20% cut in pension is. That being said, in Greece, this is another addendum to my argument, the parents give money to the kids, right? So if you cut the pension at the same time as you increase unemployment, you're hitting the same people twice, because in fact they were relying on their parents to survive, right? And in fact, this is a question: how does that then fit into this? But it's something I've been struggling with. But I hope this gives you some responses to your question. But thank you.
So I just want to thank you for a wonderful conversation. It was
Thank
really
you.
terrific.
And thank you all.